Episode 13, The Classic Board Game. The doorbell rang and Chris opened the door. His three friends all stood at his doorstep, ready for the Saturday afternoon hangout session. "Hey, what's up, man? Here's the snacks and drinks," said John. "Thanks, man," said Chris. "And here's the board game I told you about. Well, it's a makeshift version, but I hope it works," said James as he showed a large drawing paper designed exactly like an actual Ouija board. Without wasting any time, the group got started. "Okay, guys, follow my lead. Whatever you do, don't take your fingers from the coin until we have moved it to the end point," said James. "Okay, what happens if we do?" asked Chris. "From what I saw on TV, this game pulls spirits from their world into ours. So, once we start playing, the spirit is tied here. When we go to this end point, we send the spirit back to the portal for them to re-enter their world," explained James. "So what you're saying is that if we took our hands off before reaching the end point, the spirit will be released while still in our world instead?" asked Ben. "Exactly," said James. As the youths began having their fingers on a piece of coin at the starting point, James began to call out, "Are you there? Any spirit, give us a sign." However, the coin didn't move. James then called out again, "Spirit, any spirit, are you there?" Again, nothing. "Okay, this is a waste of time, man," said John. "Give it a while, man. It's gonna happen," said Ben. Suddenly, the coin began to move and stopped at the option, "Yes." "Okay, funny, who's moving it?" asked John. Everyone shook their heads to indicate that it wasn't them. "Sure it wasn't. Okay, my turn. What's your name?" asked John. The coin was slowly dragged towards the letters A, Z, A, Z, E, L. "Okay, my turn. Are you a ghost?" asked James. The coin was slowly dragged towards the option, "No." "Okay then, are you the devil?" asked John while chuckling to himself. "Hey, why did you ask that?" said Ben. "Chill, man, I honestly think one of us is pulling a fast one," said John. As the boys were busy talking, little did they realize that the coin had answered yes to John's question. "Great. See what you did there, John?" said Ben, beginning to sound uneasy. As Ben was getting scared and no longer wanting to play the game, he said to the spirit, "Okay, can we go back to the end point, please?" The coin was dragged to the option, "No." "Okay, that's it. I'm done. This isn't fun anymore," said Ben as he removed both his fingers out of the coin. "Hey, Ben, what are you doing? James said we need to end the game properly," said Chris. John then said, "Nah, it's fine. Let's do something else. I know someone here is just playing a prank on the rest of us. And what kind of name is Azazel?" said John. James rolled up the piece of paper Ouija board. The boys then played video games till the evening and left. Later that evening, as Chris was falling asleep, he suddenly heard someone singing near the edge of his bed. It sounded like a lady's voice. Chris was woken up by it but saw no one there. As Chris's eyes were slowly shutting and beginning to fall asleep, his blurry vision thought he had seen a lady in a blue dress at the edge of his bed, still singing again. Eventually the singing got softer and softer, and soon it stopped and Chris fell asleep. Suddenly, in the middle of the night, Chris was woken up by the same voice singing. Chris sat up to look around the room to see if anyone was there. Suddenly, after a moment's silence, the bed suddenly shook, gradually, then with more vigor. In fear, Chris, who was still sitting on the bed, called out, "Mom, Dad!" Chris then heard footsteps rushing towards his room. As his parents entered his room, the bed stopped shaking. "Chris, what's wrong?" said Chris's dad as he opened Chris's bedroom door. "I don't know, Dad. The bed suddenly started shaking violently," said Chris. "We heard it too from our room," said Chris's mom. After a moment's pause, Chris's mom then said to Chris's dad, "Honey, it was probably it. What else could it have been? I think it's time we let Chris know. Now that it's happening, we should tell him." Chris's dad thought about it for a while and then said, "Chris, if it is what we think it is, we somehow knew that this would happen. It was just a matter of time." "What do you mean, Dad?" asked Chris. "Well, while your mom was still pregnant with you, we bought this house from an elderly couple. They told us that they lost their daughter to cancer, and because they missed her so much, they used the Ouija board to try and get in touch with her. But instead of their daughter, they contacted an evil spirit," said Chris's dad. "What? And they just left after letting the evil spirit enter the house just like that?" asked Chris. "Well, they tried to get rid of it. The spirit was eventually tamed, stopped shaking all the furniture, and was no longer aggressively haunting them. But they really needed to leave behind the painful memory of losing their daughter. They sold to us well below market value, but they told us before they sold the house to us that there is no guarantee that the evil spirit wouldn't come back," explained Chris's dad. But my only question is, why now? Why is it disturbing Chris now?" asked Chris's mom. "That's true. Okay, Chris, you have to be honest with us. Is there something that you did that might have caused it to wake up again? Be honest, Chris," asked Chris's dad. "I played the Ouija board with my friends the other day," admitted Chris as he looked down with guilt. "Okay, so that was the reason," said Chris's dad, sounding surprisingly calm. Seemingly unorthodoxly prepared for the situation, Chris's dad immediately called for a spiritual healer he knew, named Mr. Jackval. Within half an hour, Mr. Jackval arrived and headed straight to Chris's room. "Chris, are you all right?" asked Mr. Jackval. "I don't know, sir. I'm feeling weird from the bed shake just now," said Chris. As Mr. Jackval began whispering prayers to Chris's ear, Chris's mood began to change, and he slowly began mumbling to himself as his eyes closed while seated on his bed. The mumble suddenly turned to growling, and Chris's bed started to shake violently again. "Who are you?" asked Mr. Jackval authoritatively, knowing that it was no longer Chris that he was talking to. "Azazel," replied the voice from within Chris. "Okay. For tonight we have to tie Chris down so that he won't hurt himself," said Mr. Jackval to Chris's parents. Chris began struggling. Mr. Jackval continued his prayers. Chris eventually calmed down, and they tied Chris's hands to the bed frame. Mr. Jackval walked out of the room with Chris's parents and said, "Take turns to observe Chris and make sure that he doesn't hurt himself. I will come back tomorrow night. And remember, leaving home is not an option. Seeing how it's reacting, it will just follow Chris wherever he goes." The next night, Mr. Jackval returned with a soft toy which resembled a young girl. The soft toy had red hair, eyes made of black buttons, and skin made of fabric with its sew marks seen along its body. "What is that?" asked Chris's dad while pointing to the soft toy. "You see, from our session yesterday, it was clear that the demon wasn't willing to leave without a body to linger around in our world. It would only leave a body for another object that looks close to human. Won't be easy, but it's our only choice," said Mr. Jackval. As Mr. Jackval and Chris's parents walked into Chris's room, Chris was seated on his bed, looking down, and both hands still tied to the edge of the bed. Mr. Jacques slowly began placing his prayer materials in front of Chris's bed, an item at a time. Seeing this, Chris began growling. The more items laid down, the louder the growls became. After the materials were all laid out, Chris began struggling again. Mr. Jacques sat down on the floor in front of the materials and began his prayers with the doll placed right in front of Chris. As soon as the prayers began, the bed began to shake again. The shake gradually became more vigorous up till the point where pillows fell on the floor from the violent shaking of the bed. At this point, Chris's growls peaked in aggression. Mr. Jacques knew that this was his chance, as Azazel was getting emotional and losing control. Mr. Jacques stood up, held the doll, and told Chris's parents, "Now, hold him down." As Chris struggled, Mr. Jacques held the doll up and pressed it against Chris's forehead. Mr. Jacques read out a prayer, and as Chris was still struggling and growling, Chris finally gave one last scream with a growl in his voice. Chris fell backwards on his bed with his energy seemed to have been completely sucked out of him. As Chris's parents sat beside to comfort Chris, Mr. Jacques took the doll and placed it into a metal jar. "It's done now. I'll stay here to observe as Chris heals, and we will go to a nearby beach in the morning," said Mr. Jacques. Chris looked weak but less pale now as he slept soundly through the night. In the morning, together with Chris and his parents, Mr. Jacques stood at the dock and read a final piece of prayer before throwing the jar into the open sea. The makeshift Ouija board that Chris and his friends created was then burnt, as the wind blew the ashes of the paper away. After all was said and done, Mr. Jacques gave Chris a final piece of advice. "This was a painful reminder, Chris. Never get involved with their world again. You could have lost your life. To you, it was a simple game. To them, it was a chance at entering our world and freedom to do what they want." This was a classic story that had happened countless times, a board game that brought troubles to many. Like Mr. Jacques said, to us it's a game. To them, it meant everything. The freedom to roam our world and control us however they wish to.